In a silent hangar on the edge of Wichita, 30 engineers had already failed the $80 million prototype that was supposed to save an empire, when Reid Callahan, a single father working the overnight shift, knelt down and drew 3 chalk circles on the concrete floor. CEO Vivian Ashcroft laughed and ordered him out of the test area. Reid looked at the 3 landing gear positions and told the room they had 7 minutes before they destroyed the last starter unit. Nobody believed him. But exactly 7 minutes later, the engine everyone called dead roared to life, and the silence that followed shook the entire aviation dynasty to its foundation. Stay until the end to watch the man everyone dismissed dismantle an empire using nothing but chalk, data, and the truth nobody wanted to hear. Reid Callahan arrived at the Ashcroft Aeronautics facility every night at 10:45, long after the last executive had collected his briefcase and driven away in a company car, long after the catering staff had wiped down the conference tables and the communications team had sent their final press updates of the day. His badge listed him as Night Shift Maintenance Coordinator, a title that meant almost nothing to anyone above the supervisory level, and everything to the people who actually kept the facility running between midnight and dawn. He wore the same faded olive work jacket he had owned for 6 years, carried a paper notebook instead of the company-issued tablet, and knew the specifications of every piece of ground equipment in the hangar the way other men knew their children's school schedules. Most of the younger engineers, the ones with graduate degrees and subscriptions to aerospace journals, called him the hangar guard when they thought he was out of earshot, not because they were cruel by nature, but because it never occurred to them that the man checking fluid levels and locking bay doors after dark might understand their instruments better than they did. Reid never corrected them, not because he lacked the confidence, but because the correction would have required an explanation, and the explanation would have taken time he preferred to spend on the things that actually mattered. What mattered most was Sadie. She was 12 years old, curious about everything, and had her mother's habit of asking questions that cut straight to the point before most people had finished deciding whether the question was worth asking. On the evenings before his shift, Reid made dinner while Sadie did homework at the kitchen table, and their conversations ranged from the aerodynamics of migratory birds to the exact definition of courage, which she insisted was different from bravery and wanted him to explain the distinction. The night shift meant he could take her to school in the morning, be home in the early afternoon, and sit with her through the hours when a child without a mother needed a parent who showed up without being asked. He had turned down 2 senior positions in the previous 18 months, both of which would have required travel, and neither of the managers who offered them quite understood why a man with his background would choose overnights over advancement. Reid understood perfectly. Ashcroft Aeronautics was 3 weeks away from the most important demonstration in the company's history. The Aether X-Nine, a prototype business jet valued at $80 million, had been developed over 4 years to compete in a market segment that demanded speed, range, and a level of systems integration that most manufacturers were still treating as aspirational. Blackthorne Global Aviation, whose founder Gideon Blackthorne had built his fortune on knowing exactly which bets to place and when, was evaluating the aircraft for a potential order worth $2.4 billion. Preston Lockridge, the chief engineering officer, had been compressing every timeline in the program for 6 months to make sure the demonstration happened on schedule, and the pressure he applied moved downward through the organization, the way pressure always does, faster and harder the lower it traveled. Reid had noticed a missing signature on a hangar floor survey 2 weeks earlier and submitted a note through the maintenance system. The note was acknowledged and then never acted upon. A supervising engineer told him, without particular malice, that floor surveys were an engineering department concern, and that night shift coordinators should focus on their assigned checklist. Preston Lockridge had looked at Reid's badge in the hallway outside a planning meeting one Tuesday afternoon and asked, with the pleasantly incurious tone of a man who finds organizational charts reassuring, why a maintenance coordinator was standing near a door marked Engineering Review. Vivian Ashcroft had walked past Reid 3 times in the previous week without acknowledging him. Twice while he was holding maintenance reports that contained findings relevant to the aircraft she had staked her company's future on, and once while he was repairing a calibration fixture that one of her senior engineers had broken and not reported. None of this was unusual in the context of Ashcroft Aeronautics, where authority was expressed through floor plan, and the people who actually understood the machines spent their careers in the building's lower levels. At 1:18 in the morning, the Aether X-Nine was pushed into the primary test bay for what the schedule called a final pre-demonstration systems checkout, and Reid was still in the building. The aircraft moved on tow bar with the quiet authority of something that had cost an enormous amount of money and expected to be treated accordingly, and for the first several minutes everything proceeded exactly as the checklist required. The starts sequence initiated, the instruments came alive in the correct order, and the engineering team gathered around their stations with the particular focused calm of professionals who had performed this procedure many times before. Then the left engine terminated its startup cycle 4 seconds in, the annunciator panel lit with a general fault code, and the calm evaporated. The fault code pointed to an invalid start condition, which could mean almost anything, and in the absence of a more specific indicator, every engineer defaulted to the theory that best fit his existing assumptions. Preston Lockridge announced that the engine management software had encountered a logic error and directed the software team to begin a diagnostic rollback. The software team reviewed their logs, found nothing consistent with a logic error, and suggested the problem originated in the starter motor. The starter motor supplier's on-site representative produced certification data showing the unit had passed every required test within the previous 72 hours and redirected attention toward the airframe integration team. The airframe integration team pointed at the fuel system. The fuel system engineer said his pressures were nominal and looked at the avionics rack. By the time the third attempted restart had failed and the fourth was being prepared, the group had replaced a pressure relay, 2 thermal switches, and a control module worth just under $120,000, none of which had been defective. Owen Kessler was 58 years old and had been working on turbine engines since before some of the engineers in the bay had started secondary school. He watched the fourth attempt fail with the particular expression of a man who has seen panic mistaken for diagnosis before and knows how much it costs in time and money and machinery. He told Preston that 6 consecutive failed starts with no change in fault signature meant the team was solving for the wrong variable, and that continuing to swap components in a running diagnostic would eventually damage something that was not broken. Preston told him the demonstration was in less than 40 hours, and that the time for philosophical observations had passed. Owen stepped back and said nothing more, but he did not leave the bay. Reid had been standing near the rear service door when the first alarm sounded, reviewing a ground equipment log that technically had nothing to do with the aircraft. He was not supposed to be involved, and nobody had asked him to stay. He noticed something on the hangar floor before anyone thought to move him along, and what he noticed was that the tire marks from the aircraft's previous successful ground run did not align with the current wheel positions. The nose gear was close enough to its former location, but the right main gear was resting on something subtly different from flat concrete. There was a metal access panel cover at that position, installed after the recent floor repair, and it sat approximately 12 millimeters lower than the surrounding surface. He looked at the canted position, then at the fuel state indicators on the external display panel, and understood what the flight computers were seeing. He pulled an industrial chalk marker from his jacket pocket and did not say anything to anyone yet. After the sixth failed start attempt, when the starter motor temperature had risen enough that Owen warned another cycle would require a mandatory cooldown period of several hours, Reid walked to the center of the bay and knelt on the hangar floor. Nobody stopped him immediately, because nobody was watching the man in the faded work jacket when there was an $80 million aircraft refusing to cooperate with 30 credentialed engineers. Reid knelt on the hangar floor with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man who had already solved the problem in his head and was now simply making the solution visible. And he began drawing the first of 3 circles on the bare concrete around the original tire impression left by the aircraft's previous successful ground run. The first circle marked the position where the nose gear had previously rested, centered and level on solid floor. The second circle traced the left main gear's prior location, 2 meters, aft and to the left, where the concrete was uniformly flat and the sensor beneath the strut had registered full weight with no ambiguity. The third circle was the one that mattered most, drawn around a position approximately 40 centimeters forward of where the right main gear currently sat, on stable flooring that had not been disturbed by the access panel repair work. Preston Lockridge watched this for approximately 8 seconds before asking, in a voice calibrated to carry across the entire bay, whether Reid was attempting to fix the aircraft or decorate a playground. Several engineers laughed, not unkindly but helplessly, the way people laugh when tension needs somewhere to go, and mockery is the nearest available direction. Vivian Ashcroft had been standing near the instrument cluster, reviewing the fault log when the laughter reached her, and she turned to find a man in a faded work jacket crouched on her hangar floor drawing white circles with a piece of chalk. She looked at the 3 shapes, looked at Reid, and said with the practiced patience of someone managing a difficult press situation that the company needed an engineer, and not, with respect, a sidewalk artist. Reid stood and addressed the room without raising his voice. He explained that the right main gear strut was currently resting on the access panel cover, which had settled 12 millimeters below surrounding floor level since the repair. He explained that the fuel load in the right wing tank was lower than the left, which had shifted enough weight distribution that the right main gear strut had partially decompressed. He explained that the weight-on-wheels sensor on that strut was already calibrated close to its threshold and had crossed into the in-flight state as a result of the combined displacement. He explained that the flight control computer was therefore receiving 2 signals confirming ground contact and 1 signal indicating the aircraft was airborne, and that the safety interlock had correctly refused to authorize a high-power ignition cycle under those contradictory conditions. The engine had never failed. The engine was being protected from a command it was not yet authorized to receive. Preston said a 12-millimeter floor depression could not disable an $80 million aircraft. Reid said the floor depression had not disabled anything. The safety system had done exactly what it was designed to do, and the only thing stopping the engine was a single sensor reporting a position the aircraft was not actually in. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, and then, without warmth but with the directness of someone who had run out of better options, told him he had exactly 7 minutes to prove that 3 chalk circles represented something actionable. If the engine did not start within that window, he would leave the test area and not return. Owen moved before anyone could object, attaching the tow bar to the nose gear while Reid called out the sequence in the order that minimized risk: power isolation first, then auxiliary system reset, then reposition, then sensor verification. Minute 1, the starter temperature was confirmed safe. Minute 2, the tow bar was engaged and secured. Minute 3, the aircraft shifted 40 centimeters across the hangar floor, its right main gear lifting clear of the sunken panel. Minute 4, all 3 gear positions settled onto solid concrete inside the 3 chalk circles. Minute 5, all 3 weight-on-wheels sensors registered ground contact simultaneously. Minute 6, The control computer completed its verification cycle and cleared for ignition. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, Owen pressed the start command. The starter unit engaged. Fuel reached the combustion chamber in the correct sequence. A blue ignition flash appeared behind the engine inlet, and then the turbine wound up through its characteristic rising tone and steadied into the even roar of an engine at idle. The hangar floor trembled slightly under the vibration. Every person in the room who had been looking at a screen or a component looked up at the same moment. The engineers who had laughed 8 minutes earlier were perfectly still. Vivian Ashcroft stared at the left engine, running at stable idle, and then looked down at the 3 chalk circles centered precisely under the 3 landing gear positions. Reid wrote the start time in his paper notebook and did not celebrate. When Vivian asked where he had learned to diagnose a fault that way, Reid answered that he had learned it in places where the investigation happened before the expensive parts got replaced. By 4 in the morning, Vivian had made 3 phone calls and reached a decision. The incident would be categorized internally as a pre-demonstration calibration adjustment, the kind of technical refinement that occurred in every flight test program and meant nothing beyond the engineering department. Preston was given 30 minutes to produce a written summary of how the fault had been identified and resolved, and the summary that emerged described a coordinated systems review led by the engineering integration team, in which sensor cross-referencing and airframe positioning had been used to isolate a transient signal anomaly. Reid Callahan's name appeared nowhere in the document. The chalk circles on the hangar floor, which Owen had photographed from 3 different angles on his personal phone before anyone thought to ask him to stop, were identified by one of the senior engineers as an eyesore that would reflect poorly on the program if Blackthorn's technical team saw them during the morning walkthrough. Owen objected loudly enough that 2 other technicians turned around from their workstations. Reid put a hand on his arm and told him quietly to save the photographs somewhere that was not the company server, then got a mop and cleaning solution from the equipment room and erased his own work from the floor without being asked twice. Gideon Blackthorn arrived at the facility 4 hours ahead of his scheduled tour, accompanied by 2 members of his technical advisory group and no publicist, and he moved through the hangar without the practiced enthusiasm that most evaluators displayed when they wanted to appear impressed. He asked specific questions about maintenance access intervals, sensor abroad cycles, and the load-bearing tolerances of the landing gear attachment points. When he asked who had performed the calibration adjustment on the ground sensor array the previous night, Preston said the resolution had emerged from the integrated systems team working through a standard verification sequence. Gideon accepted the answer without visible reaction and moved on. What Preston did not observe was that Gideon had already noticed Reid at the far end of the hangar, working through the tow equipment storage with the methodical attention of someone whose mind was not entirely on the task in front of him. Gideon noticed the paper notebook. He noticed the way Reid looked at the aircraft, not with the pride of someone who had built it, but with the continuous assessment of someone who was still thinking about it. He said nothing and finished the tour. The same afternoon, Preston placed a corrective action request on Reid's desk, requiring him to sign a maintenance certification confirming the Aether X-Nine was flight-ready for the upcoming demonstration, and the document omitted 3 specific data points: the original floor survey showing the access panel settlement, the sensor calibration records from the previous 3 weeks, and any independent verification that the panel had been properly corrected since the repositioning. Reid told Preston he would sign the document when those records were attached. Preston said the floor condition was a resolved item and that a night shift coordinator was not positioned to block a program-level certification. Reid said his position was not the relevant issue, the completeness of the record was. That conversation ended without resolution and was escalated to Vivienne, who met with Reid in her glass-walled office above the hangar for 11 minutes, during which she acknowledged his contribution with the measured appreciation of someone closing an account, and explained that a single diagnostic success did not entitle a maintenance coordinator to hold a multi-billion-dollar program to his personal documentation standards. Reid reminded her that 7 minutes before that diagnostic success, not one person in the room had been able to explain why the engine would not start. Vivienne offered him a bonus equivalent to 1 month's salary in exchange for his signature and his discretion. He declined both without hesitation. He said he had no interest in recognition, but that his name would not appear below a statement he could not verify. That evening, Owen forwarded Reid 2 images captured from the document management system. The first was the original hangar floor survey, with the access panel settlement clearly annotated in red. The second was a replacement document occupying the same file location with a different creation timestamp and a certification signature from a company called Lockridge Industrial Survey, LLC. Reid looked up the registered address. It matched a holding address shared by an investment fund registered under Preston Lockridge's family name. Reid did not access any restricted systems. He did not break any locks or request any files he was not authorized to view in his role as night shift coordinator. What he did was read carefully, compare methodically, and think with the particular patience of someone who had spent years in environments where a missed detail had real physical consequences. He pulled the maintenance access logs, the fuel load records from the previous 6 ground runs, the ground equipment service invoices, and the environmental compliance certificates filed when the hangar floor renovation had been approved. He spread everything across the equipment supervisor's desk at 2 in the morning, with Owen sitting across from him and a thermos of coffee between them. The sensor anomaly had not appeared for the first time on the night of the failed ground run. The calibration drift on the right main gear weight on wheels unit had been visible in the monitoring data for 3 weeks, flagged twice by the automated system and marked as non-significant environmental noise by an administrator account that traced back to Preston's department. The access panel had been installed by a subcontractor hired through Lockridge Industrial Survey, which had in turn subcontracted the actual concrete work to a regional firm at approximately 40% of the build cost. The gap between what Ashcroft Aeronautics had paid and what the concrete firm had charged was $4.8 million, and the accounting trail for that difference led directly into the same family holding fund whose address Reid had identified the previous evening. Preston had not ordered anyone to sabotage the aircraft. The situation was considerably more ordinary than that, and in its ordinariness considerably more damning. He had approved a renovation through a contractor that paid him indirectly, suppressed the quality control data that would have flagged the inadequate workmanship, and pressured the software team to widen the sensor acceptance threshold so that the marginal calibration signals would not generate alerts. None of that had been intended to cause a failure. It had been intended to prevent a failure from being discovered before the demonstration. The failure had happened anyway, because physics does not negotiate with financial incentives. The software modification request was the piece that alarmed Reid most. If the sensor threshold change had been committed to the aircraft's certified baseline, any future evaluator reviewing the flight test data would have been working from parameters that had been quietly adjusted without documentation or authorization. Reid wrote up his findings in a formal maintenance observation report, attached the supporting materials he was permitted to share, and submitted it through the compliance portal to the chief safety officer and to Vivienne directly. Within 40 minutes, the report disappeared from the shared document index. It did not return an error when he searched for it. It simply was not there. His submission receipt remained in his sent records. The document had existed, had been received, and had then been removed by someone with administrative access to the compliance system. Reid told Owen what had happened and asked him to keep the photographs in 2 separate locations, neither of which was connected to the company network. He did not tell Sadie anything specific when he came home that afternoon. She noticed he was quieter than usual. The focused quiet that meant something was working itself through his reasoning, and asked only whether everything was all right. He said that sometimes doing the right thing meant absorbing the cost of it before anyone else recognized the value. She thought about that and said it sounded like something her mother would have said. He agreed that it did. The night before the demonstration, Reid ran his standard maintenance sweep of the Aether X-Nine and confirmed that the revised software build had been loaded onto the aircraft's flight management system. The version number had been incremented to resemble a routine update. The change log contained no reference to sensor parameter modification. Reid submitted a formal request to halt the demonstration at 6:45 the following morning, citing the unauthorized software modification and the unresolved floor survey discrepancy. The request was routed to Preston, who responded within 20 minutes with a written rebuttal stating that the software change was a validated improvement, designed to filter spurious warning events, and that the hangar floor condition was a closed item. He copied 5 members of the executive team and the company's general counsel. Reid read the rebuttal, noted that it addressed neither the sensor threshold numbers nor the missing documentation, and began preparing a secondary filing. Vivian called him into a conference room on the executive floor at 8:15. The room had floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, a view of the flight line, and furniture that cost more than the annual salary of everyone who maintained the aircraft parked outside. Her legal representative sat to her left. A folder rested on the table between them containing a non-disclosure agreement, a check for $150,000, and a letter offering a 6-month consulting arrangement contingent on the demonstration proceeding on schedule. She told him this was an opportunity most people in his position did not receive twice. Reid looked at the folder without touching it and asked whether she was purchasing his expertise or his silence. Vivienne said she was paying for his cooperation. He said those were 3 different things and she had priced only one of them. He pushed the folder back across the table and said that Sadie did not live in a house with a flight line view, but that he intended for her to grow up believing her father's name carried consistent meaning, regardless of what was on the other side of the table. Vivienne said he was using his daughter as a rhetorical device to resist a professional obligation. He said he was explaining his position, not asking for her sympathy. He put 3 questions on the table. He asked who had approved the hangar renovation contract. He asked who had authorized the removal of sensor calibration warnings from the monitoring record. He asked who had requested the software parameter modification before any investigation had been completed into the prior night's fault. Vivienne did not answer any of them. Preston entered without knocking and announced that Reid's personnel record contained documentation of a mid-contract departure from a defense subcontractor during an active test program, which did not support the portrait of principled reliability that Reid was presenting. Reid confirmed the departure and explained its context. He had resigned after the program director instructed him to sign a test report characterizing a structural resonance anomaly as within acceptable limits when the raw data showed it was not. He had refused, submitted a dissenting technical note, and left when the note was removed from the program record. The program director had later been named in an audit, identifying 3 documentation irregularities in the same test sequence. Preston said Reid had a pattern of converting professional disagreements into personal crusades. Reid said patterns could be read in multiple directions, and that Preston was welcome to present his version to an independent evaluator. Vivienne told him the demonstration would proceed. Owen met Reid in the equipment room 20 minutes later and said that sometimes the only rational response was to walk away and let the institution collapse under its own weight. Reid said he had no interest in protecting Vivienne's reputation or Preston's position, but that the test crew would be inside the aircraft the next morning, and they had not done anything to deserve flying a safety system that had been quietly adjusted to stop reporting accurately. Owen was quiet for a moment, and then asked what he needed. Reid said he needed his maintenance reports to exist somewhere that an administrative deletion could not reach. Owen said he would handle it. Reid printed 3 copies of his submission receipts and placed them in an envelope that he left with his personal belongings, not in his company locker. The next morning, the Aether X-9 was towed to the flight line under a clear sky. Reid stood outside the perimeter fence with a deactivated badge in his jacket pocket, watching through chain link. The observation area had been arranged with the care of a facility that understood it was performing as much as demonstrating. Rows of chairs, a temporary canopy, a sound system for the introductory remarks, and a buffet that cost more to staff than most of the ground crew earned in a month. Gideon Blackthorne arrived with his advisory team and took a seat in the second row rather than the front, a habit he had developed over decades of watching people perform for the wrong audience. Members of the company's board occupied the first row with the expectant posture of people who anticipated watching a stock price rise before mid-morning. A half-dozen industry journalists stood along the side boundary with credentials and cameras already raised. Vivienne opened with remarks that balanced technical precision with corporate optimism in the proportions calculated to impress everyone assembled. Preston stood at the edge of the staging area and confirmed to each board member who approached him that every system on the aircraft had been fully verified. The test crew ran through their pre-start checklist and brought both engines online without incident, which was expected because the aircraft was sitting on flat uniform pavement and all 3 weight-on-wheels sensors were reading identically. The sound of the engines at idle was impressive in the way that all well-designed turbines are impressive, and several journalists were photographing before anyone had said anything worth documenting. Reid was standing outside the secondary perimeter fence at a point where the maintenance monitoring terminal was accessible from the public-facing side of the flight line. The terminal displayed the same aircraft status information that ground crews used during normal operations, and his deactivated credential was not required to read it. He watched the engine instruments cycle through the post-start checks and saw nothing alarming until the test crew ran the landing gear system through its state verification sequence in preparation for simulating a transition to flight conditions. The warning indicator on the right main gear channel appeared for approximately 1/3 of a second and then cleared. The duration was too brief to register as an actionable alert under the new software parameters. Under the original parameters, it would have triggered a mandatory hold. The aircraft was not in immediate danger on the ground, but if the data generated during this demonstration became the baseline for the certification test record, the program would be certified on measurements that did not accurately reflect how the system behaved under stress. Reid called Owen, who did not answer because Preston had positioned himself near Owen's workstation under the pretense of reviewing a ground equipment log. Reid looked at the tarmac safety office number printed on the ground operations card visible through the fence and called it from his personal phone. He identified himself by name and employee number, stated that he was a former credential holder with a documented maintenance filing on record, and reported the specific software version, the sensor channel designation, and the duration and timestamp of the anomaly he had just observed. He said the anomaly was below the current alert threshold due to an undocumented parameter change and requested that the ground safety team conduct a mandatory systems hold before the aircraft entered the active runway. The safety team was required by regulation to verify the report before clearing the aircraft to proceed. The Aether X-9 was held at the taxiway entrance while a ground inspector connected to the maintenance monitoring terminal. The inspection took 9 minutes. The demonstration did not resume. The journalists began asking questions that nobody at the staging area wanted to answer. Vivienne was informed by her operations coordinator that the hold had been triggered by a former employee and was mandatory under the safety protocol she had personally signed when the test program launched. She said Reid's name with an expression that suggested she was deciding how angry to be, and then resolved the question publicly and immediately. In front of the board, the journalists, and Gideon Blackthorne, she announced that Reid Callahan's employment was terminated effective that moment, and that his interference with a certified flight program would be reviewed for potential legal action. Preston said a night shift coordinator did not have the standing to override the judgment of a full engineering team. Reid, who had not moved from outside the fence, said he would like to know whether a title was capable of converting inaccurate data into accurate data. Gideon Blackthorne heard the question from 12 meters away and said nothing. Evelyn Hartwell, the Safety Certification Group director, who had arrived that morning for what was supposed to be a routine observation, asked Vivienne's operations team for the maintenance submission that had triggered the safety hold. The compliance system showed no record of any such filing. Reid produced his printed receipt from the envelope in his jacket pocket. Evelyn took one look at the timestamp and the document identifier and requested an immediate server log preservation order. Preston moved toward the operations tent and then stopped when he realized there was no longer anyone at that tent who would take a direction from him. The server logs told a story that no internal document could reframe. The maintenance submission Reid had filed the previous morning had been accessed by an administrative account 11 minutes after delivery and removed from the shared index without a deletion record, a procedure that required bypassing the system's standard audit trail, which in turn required elevated access credentials belonging to the office of the chief engineering officer. The logs also showed that the software build loaded onto the Aether X-Nine had been promoted to the aircraft's baseline configuration without the mandatory dual approval process that the program's own quality manual required. Evelyn Hartwell documented both findings before noon and placed the program under formal certification suspension pending independent investigation. The board convened an emergency session within the hour. Preston's response to the assembled directors was that Reid had acted as a disgruntled former employee, using procedural mechanisms to damage a program that had embarrassed him by not crediting his contribution of the previous week. The board asked him to explain the administrative deletion of a filed safety report. Preston said his office managed a high volume of documents and that his staff occasionally archived submissions that appeared duplicative. A board member asked whether Reid's submission had appeared duplicative. Preston said it had contained unverified claims. The board member asked why an unverified safety claim would be archived rather than investigated. Preston did not have a prepared answer. Owen brought his photographs to Evelyn's team and provided a written account of the hangar floor condition, the aircraft positioning on the sunken access panel, and the events of the previous night's ground run. The images showed the chalk circles, the tire positions, and the gap between the panel surface and the surrounding concrete, all documented before anyone had touched the floor. The document on file for the original floor survey was the replacement version, and a forensic timestamp comparison with the maintenance activity logs showed it had been created after the renovation was complete rather than before it. The certification signature on the document belonged to Lockridge Industrial Survey, and the company's registration information, financial disclosures, and subcontracting records took a financial investigator approximately 2 hours to trace back to the Lockridge family holding structure. Preston's assistant, when asked directly by the company's general counsel in the presence of the board's independent legal representative, confirmed that the administrative deletions and the software promotion had both been performed on direct instruction, and that she had retained a written record of that authorization in her personal email archive. For reasons she described simply as professional caution, the board voted to suspend Preston from all program responsibilities, pending a full forensic accounting review. Vivian found Reid at the small diner near Sadie's school 2 days after the suspension, in the quiet hour after the morning drop-off, and told him directly that she was asking for his help in stabilizing the company through the investigation, not as an act of forgiveness, but as a recognition that her remaining options were limited, and she had finally accepted what that meant. Reid asked whether she wanted him to help correct the aircraft program, or help manage how the story about the aircraft program was being told. She said the two were the same thing now. He said they had never been the same thing, and that the confusion between them was the root cause of every problem the company was now working through. He agreed to cooperate fully with Evelyn's independent review on 3 conditions he stated without apology. Everything he contributed would become part of the formal investigation record. Nothing would be attributed to sources or summarized in language that obscured what the data showed. And his participation would carry no contractual implications regarding the confidentiality of findings. The reconstruction of the fault sequence took 3 days, with Reid and Evelyn working through the sensor logs, the floor survey data, the software version history, and the contractor financial records until the complete chain was documented in terms that were unambiguous, verifiable, and would survive scrutiny in any proceeding that followed. The preliminary report was direct. The Aether X-Nine's engine had never malfunctioned. The systems designed to protect it had functioned correctly. What had failed was the management structure of Ashcroft Aeronautics. The board's special session convened in the 12th floor conference room, the one with the company's founding history on one wall and a clear view of the hangar complex below. Preston arrived with 2 attorneys and a 30-page prepared statement characterizing the entire sequence of events as a regulatory misunderstanding, compounded by the actions of a volatile former employee. He sat at the far end of the table, with the composed expression of someone who had survived difficult meetings before and expected to survive this one. Evelyn Hartwell introduced Reid as an independent technical expert retained by the certification review panel, and he walked to the head of the table without looking at Preston. The first image on the screen behind him was a photograph of 3 white chalk circles on a concrete floor, taken from above at an angle that showed all 3 positions clearly and the gap beneath the right main gear panel in the lower corner of the frame. A board member in the 3rd seat asked what 3 chalk drawings had to do with a $2.4 billion contract. Reid addressed him without condescension and without warmth. The first circle established the correct nose gear position for stable sensor registration. The second circle established the correct left main gear position. The third circle identified the position where the right main gear should have been resting and had not been, because the floor beneath it had been improperly finished by a contractor whose payment flowed back to the office of the chief engineering officer. He then walked through the complete sensor data sequence from the night of the failed ground run, the calibration records that had been classified as noise, the software modification made to prevent future alerts rather than to resolve the underlying condition, and the document deletion performed to ensure the certification record contained no trace of any of it. Preston interrupted to say that Reid was constructing a narrative from technical details that had innocent explanations, and that the board should weigh the source. A terminated employee with a documented history of abandoning projects when management disagreed with his analysis. Reid allowed him to finish, and then said that Preston was correct, that he had left a previous program over a disagreement with management, and that the disagreement had been about whether a test report should accurately describe what the data showed, and that he did not consider that history a weakness in his credibility. He said he found it difficult to understand how a man who had approved a falsified floor survey, suppressed 3 weeks of calibration data, modified flight software without authorization, and deleted a safety filing could present another person's insistence on accurate records as a character deficiency. The room was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Gideon Blackthorne, who had been listening from a chair along the side wall with the same measured attentiveness he had shown during the hangar tour, spoke for the first time. He said that Blackthorne Global Aviation would not be canceling its evaluation, but that the terms of any eventual agreement would require a restructured safety oversight function operating independently of both the executive office and the commercial program team. He added that the diagnostic method Reid had applied in the hangar the previous week was not improvised, that it had originated in a protocol document his own engineering teams had been trained on for several years, and that the protocol was formally identified by the name of its author. He looked at Preston when he said that. Preston said nothing. The board voted to terminate Preston's contract, refer the contractor payment records to the appropriate regulatory bodies, and restructure the safety certification function with independent reporting authority. Vivian sat at the head of the table through the vote with the expression of someone who had made the wrong choices for understandable reasons, and was now watching the consequences arrive in an orderly sequence. Preston's access credentials were deactivated before he reached the elevator. He left the building without a statement. After the session ended, the board's chairperson asked Reid whether he would accept a formal role in the restructured organization. He said he would consider it under 2 conditions: that the safety function reported to the Independent Oversight Committee and not to the CEO's office, and that his schedule accommodated his obligation to take his daughter to school in the morning. Both conditions were approved without argument. Vivienne, who had once called him a sidewalk artist in front of 30 people, formally requested that he sign the company's new safety standards document. Reid read every page before he picked up the pen. Nobody in the room said a word to hurry him. Preston Lockridge was referred for investigation on 3 counts: procurement fraud in connection with the Lockridge Industrial Survey contracts, falsification of quality certification records, and obstruction of a mandatory safety reporting process. 3 members of his department who had participated in suppressing the calibration warnings were suspended pending the outcome of the broader review. The financial audit traced the contractor billing discrepancy across 4 separate transactions, all of which terminated in the same family holding structure that Reid had identified, from a registered address on the night he first connected the floor survey to the survey company. Ashcroft Aeronautics announced publicly that the Aether X-Nine program had been placed under independent safety review, and that the demonstration timeline was being extended to allow complete documentation of all ground test activities. The statement did not use the word delay. The industry journalists who had witnessed the aborted flight line demonstration wrote their own accounts without the benefit of a company briefing, and the coverage was detailed and unsparing in ways that a controlled narrative would have prevented. Vivienne was not removed from her position. The board placed the company under a compliance monitoring structure for 18 months and required her to present to the Independent Oversight Committee quarterly. She was no longer authorized to approve any safety certification decision independently, and that restriction was written into the company's governance documents rather than left as an informal understanding. In a company-wide meeting held in the main hangar, she stood at the base of the platform where the Aether X-Nine was parked and told the assembled staff directly that a warning had been raised by someone on the overnight shift. That the warning had been dismissed because of where it came from rather than what it contained, and that this was a failure of the organization's leadership, beginning with herself. The Aether X-Nine completed its full certification test sequence 8 weeks later. After the hangar floor was repaired to the original specification, the weight-on-wheels sensors were recalibrated to the correct parameters. The unauthorized software build was removed from the aircraft's baseline, and the safety warning protocols were restored and formally documented. The engine that had been called dead completed 412 hours of ground and flight testing without a single fault code. The engine manufacturer received a written acknowledgement clearing their product of any connection to the program failure. Owen Kessler was named to lead a new technical training division, a position he accepted on the condition that he would still be permitted to work on engines when the schedule allowed. Reid declined the private office on the executive floor. He chose a workspace adjacent to the hangar, with a window onto the test bay and a door that technicians could knock on without an appointment. Vivian asked him once, in a quiet hallway outside the Oversight Committee's first quarterly session, why he had not pressed his advantage during the board proceedings to secure a larger mandate. He told her that authority was only useful when it created space for other people to tell the truth, and that any structure built primarily to reward the person who had survived the preceding crisis was already carrying the wrong incentives. She looked at him for a long moment and said she was beginning to understand why he had refused to sign her documents. He said he thought she had probably understood at the time and had simply hoped the money would prove to be a faster solution. She did not argue the point. 6 months after the board session, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, the Aether X-Nine taxied out of the primary hangar for what the program log identified as Flight 51, the first flight conducted under the fully reinstated certification baseline after all corrective actions had been formally closed. Reid watched the departure from the ground control monitoring station, rather than the press viewing area, which suited him because it meant he could see the actual instrument readouts, rather than a carefully positioned display of the aircraft's most photogenic angle, and because there was no one at the monitoring station who required him to perform composure. The 3 chalk circles were still on the hangar floor. They had been preserved under a coat of clear sealant at Reid's request after the investigation concluded, framed in a 6-centimeter border of yellow safety paint, and accompanied by a small placard that described the Callahan tri-state isolation method and the sequence of events that had taken place at those coordinates. The placard had been Evelyn's idea. Reid had approved the text after asking that it be accurate about the failure modes, rather than complimentary about any individual involved. Sadie came to the facility on a family open house day in late spring and stood in front of the 3 circles for a long time, reading the placard and then looking at the floor and then at the aircraft parked at the far end of the bay. A junior engineer, one of the new hires brought in during the restructuring, told her that the 3 circles had kept the program alive. Sadie said that was not exactly right, that her father had read what the aircraft was already communicating to anyone who knew how to listen, and that the circles were only a way of making the message visible to people who had been too busy to look. The junior engineer glanced at Reid, who was standing a few meters away, and Reid offered nothing to clarify or expand on what his daughter had said, because it was accurate and he had nothing to add to it. Vivian approached and stood beside the circles without interrupting the quiet. She said they had changed the company. Reid said the circles had not changed anything. The company had changed when it stopped trying to erase what the circles represented, and that was a different thing entirely. Vivian nodded and did not argue. The Aether X-Nine rolled through the open hangar doors as Reid gathered his jacket from the back of his chair. The turbines rose through their startup sequence, steadied at idle, and then pushed the aircraft forward into the morning light with the even confidence of a system that had nothing left to prove. Behind him was the Empire that had once handed him a mop and asked him to clean up after himself. Ahead of him was the school where Sadie was waiting by the front gate. The same front gate he had driven to every single morning since the night he had decided that certain things were worth more than the titles attached to them. And 3 chalk circles on a concrete floor were all the evidence anyone who had ever doubted that decision would ever need.